Today, we're going to talk about customer segmentation, the art and science of putting people into groups. And why would you want to do that? Because different people need different things. I'm going to do that with Eva Achten from Telenet and Roel Palmers from Choreograph, part of Group M, media agency. Welcome to both of you.
Hi, Nicole. Hi, everybody.
Was it 2022 Telenet, about 3 years ago, that we started together on a customer segmentation journey?
We did.
And quite a few things have changed since then. In fact, things have improved. I heard that one of your media campaigns, the click-through rates improved with almost 50%.
Yes, thanks to the segmentation.
Indeed, that was quite a success.
Yeah.
Now, not all segmentations are as successful. So what we'd like to do is start with listening to a piece, I would say a piece of symphony, which is kind of a symbol of how segmentation can also run out to be. Okay. So I would say, sit back, listen also to the audience and enjoy the symphony. Roel, what did you think of the symphony?
Nicole, can I be honest? For me, this segmentation was rather a cacophony than a symphony.
Cacophony.
Yeah, it was a bit of pain to my ears. I hope it was still a trial run or a beginning of a practice session, because it
didn't come down well. Down well for you. Eva, why do you think we have chosen this piece of music, I should say, not symphony, piece of music, especially in relationship to the implementation of a segmentation?
Well, I have to say it does ring a bell. A segmentation exercise is often complex, and it's really important also there to include the different parties within an organization that will later on use the segmentation, make sure that everybody is aligned, has the same vision. And in that sense, you could compare it to the different players in an orchestra, let's say, and all parties aligning them, contributing together towards an end piece, the final pièce de résistance, let's say, also for an audience, and because the segmentation is also done with an audience or consumers in mind. Was that a bit analogy?
Really right. I mean, the reason why we have chosen that is the orchestra for us or the stakeholders. And you want to make sure from the start that all stakeholders are aligned, that they share that vision and the vision of the conductor, in front of the orchestra. Because, if they're not aligned, then you're basically starting on a false foot almost. And we see very often when companies want to embark on a segmentation that we can't get the stakeholders aligned, and then, it fails. But there are other reasons why sometimes, it's a struggle to get segmentation land well. One of the words that very often is mentioned is actionability. Segments need to be actionable. What are we going to do with it? If they don't recognize them, it's nice on paper, it's nice pictures, nice visuals, personas, but very often they end up in the drawer because they don't recognize them, or they're too fluffy, too attitudinal, we don't recognize them in the street. So that's one of the key reasons as well. On top of that, what we very often hear when we talk to customers, they say, why would we need a customer segmentation? We know our customers so well. These people have been in their job for 10, 20, 30 years, and they think, I don't need to learn anything anymore. But we all know, knowing customers from behind the desk is very different to listening to them. And also the world keeps changing, as we all know, unfortunately, maybe a little bit too fast. But that's why, it is important to keep listening to your customers, I would say, and understand what the differences are, because that's what customer segmentation is all about. At the flip side of it, we do have organizations as well that do believe in segmentation, but they think that every single question that they have about customers can be answered through a customer segmentation. And of course, that doesn't work either, and then the kind of unrealistic expectations can also be a hurdle, I would say.
I would also like to add the word embed is crucial in that sentence, because customer segmentation needs to be embedded into an organization. I often have the feeling when I talk to marketeers that there's the perception that it stops after the analysis, but it's not true. It's even the contrary. Those insights are oxygen for the company. But when I talk about with them, let's say 6 months later or 1, 2, 3 years later, I often remark that it just stopped living within the company. So embed.
Embed, yeah.
Very crucial word for me. And what do you think?
You're both right, or at least I share the same experience, let's say. To start with, indeed, there are a lot of different use cases that can be tackled, let's say, by a segmentation. Let's say it can be product development, it can be targeting for a campaign, a communication campaign, can be lots of other things. But it's important to get everybody on board on what is the goal that we want to achieve with this segmentation. So really have that buy-in. There is not a one-size-fits-all. Some trade-off needs to be made, and that can be a challenge, of course. And the other thing is, like you mentioned, it embed to make sure that it lands in the company and not the presentation done up. Let's move on. Hey, you want really people to embrace the segments. And therefore, it's important to find that balance between having a segmentation that's simple enough to use and yet granular enough to be relevant.
So then, kind of, if we track back 2 or 3 years when we started, so you were aware of all the challenges that that could be. Nevertheless, you started segmentation.
Yes.
Can you take us back kind of 3 years ago and kind of tell us how this whole process started at Telenet?
So we didn't start from a blank page. We had already a segmentation that was fairly used. It was well used across the company, but the world had changed. We were post-COVID, consumer changed, the world changed, behavior changed, attitudes changed, So we wanted really to have an updated view on the telecom consumer market, but also we wanted to be able to use a segmentation for more use cases than we did with the previous segmentation.
I'm really curious now because you talk about use cases, but let's start with the goals. What did you want to achieve with this segmentation for Telenet? And
so we had 2 main goals, let's say. First is what I mentioned. It started from this need for a more updated consumer understanding. And then why would we want that? So we wanted to be able to or to guide our teams into offering the right products and services for the right consumers with the right message and also through the right communication channel. So we needed some more insights in order to enable that one. And then a second goal was also that we wanted to map the segmentation on our customer base. So we wanted for every customer in our customer base, we wanted to know to which segment he or she belonged in order also to increase our knowledge about the customers and also be able to be more relevant, improve customer experience, etc.
Okay. Those are very clear goals, but did you also have, for example, success criteria on which you would measure the outcome?
Yeah, we had first we had some requirements, and the requirements there were I mentioned that the world had changed. We anticipated that there would be a lot of more smaller segments emerging, etc. And we wanted also to have enough insight into those segments. So hence, we needed segmentation to be granular enough, keeping simplicity and understandability, of course. But it also meant that we needed a lot of respondents. We had over 10,000 customers and non-customers responding to our survey. So that was the second one. Thirdly, we wanted to be able to use a segmentation to target as well as our own customers and non-customers in communication. And then we wanted to map it, as I mentioned earlier on.
Interesting.
Would you say, thinking now with the use of the segmentation, that it has been a cacophony or is it a symphony?
I'd like to think it's a symphony. We do have some proof points of that. So we ended up with a solid segmentation, first of all, thanks to you, thanks to boobook. And we use that segmentation also for a dual brand strategy. So which segments to target with either the base or the Telenet brand. We also were able to map our customers onto the segment. So that was also a success. And then last but not least, we also use the segmentation really nearly daily still in our media buying to target consumers and also non-customers. You will tell a bit more about that, yes.
If you would have to think about kind of the key success criteria that led to, you know, the fact that this is a symphony, what would you say, or the key things to that made this a success?
I'd say it starts really with the buy-in of the different stakeholders throughout the journey, not only at the start, but also you need to make some choices and changes later on. Also, you need to make sure that it lands well and also make it as simple and as recognizable as possible. For instance, we had, as I mentioned, already a segmentation. We fairly used live stage at Telenet. And also by incorporating that, we really included it as a skeleton, let's say, within the segmentation. It also helps, like, make it recognizable. That also makes it gets adopted quicker or faster.
Yeah. It's, as you said already before, is kind of getting that buy-in from stakeholders as well, getting that belief. Very often we see that if belief is not there from the start, then, you know, it stops pretty early, you know. So it's even if we get a request to do a segmentation or run a segmentation, as we call it, we first want to understand all the stakeholders behind that request, because if it's not, then, you know, it stops. It stops before it started. And one way that we often create that belief or buy-in is show some kind of success stories, like here, of course, today, because, you know, you don't want it to be a theoretical exercise, something that ends up in a drawer, but something that's, you know, it can happen in real life. And another element that can create success, I think the word use case has already been mentioned a few times. And that's, to me, very often what the trick is. You know, you listen to the stakeholders, you hear, you know, what's going on, what are they struggling with. And if you can have an answer to those struggles, i.e. case studies, that typically works well as well.
Yeah. And that brings us to another point that's another important aspect into what makes segmentation a success. And that's really, like you mentioned, listen to the stakeholders, but also prioritize and make choices. And it starts with all the topics. We have a lot of stakeholders who want to include their topic. It's about deciding, prioritizing on what are we going to take into account and take along with the research. But it also, in terms of clusters, when the analysis is done, you often have a different choice of clusters. And then it's not necessarily going for the statistically most relevant choice, but for the choice that is perhaps a bit less statistically correct, but more actionable.
Yeah.
That's also an important choice that needs to be made. And even the naming of the segments, we started off and did even already a first dry run presentation with our segment names. And then it turned out that one name was interpreted in a different way that we anticipated. And we even decided at that moment to change the name because we wanted to have maximal buy-in, and we did not want people to think about other things that what we meant. So it's really also questioning yourself and daring to adapt also if needed.
Yes, again, it's that involvement of stakeholders. To me, that's almost, the most crucial, most difficult part. When we think about segmentation, very often we think about, analyzing customer data, the number crunching. I very often refer to that as the easy part. That's pretty easy. Almost, there's so many machines that can do that these days. But it's making sure that you create something that really, answers the question of the stakeholders. And that's kind of the more difficult bit. Yeah.
Maybe a good question then is, what do you mean exactly with involving all the key stakeholders?
That is indeed a good question, because what is involvement? It really starts with listening. Listening, what do they need? Why do they believe, or why do they not believe in segmentation? Because very often it's one of the two, What have they struggled with in the past? Most companies, they've used one segmentation in the past, even if it's age or gender, kind of understanding, what worked well, what didn't work well. And that often ends up in kind of a list of, I often call it a wish list of what they ideally we want to get. And then another part of the involvement is then working together on that wish list, kind of shorten it, you know, what's kind of very important, what's less important, because answer is everything, as I've said in the start. Again, that's where it often goes wrong. Do you remember, Eva, we also had a pretty long wish list, you know, when we started, because there were 20 stakeholders that you said that we needed to satisfy?
Yeah. So indeed, we had like a core team of about 20 colleagues coming from 9 different departments. So it was quite diverse. So we really needed to make also trade-offs, of course, in number of topics that we wanted to include. And next to that, you also want to have as many use cases served with your segmentation, but that's not always possible with only one methodology. So there it's important to also explain why you would make certain trade-offs, the pros and cons of every trade-off, to make sure everybody is aligned, agrees on that, and then only then move forward and go to the next step. But luckily, we did not need to make trade-offs for everything. And we had a big challenge that for which no trade-off was needed that we could solve. And that was we wanted to include both behavioral aspects and attitudinal aspects in the segmentation. And you might say, oh, that's not difficult. You just add those questions in the questionnaire. And that is what we did. And that's not the difficult part, of course. The difficult part was that we wanted to map the segmentation or the segments on our customer base. And in our customer base, we have information about usage of our customers, but not about their attitudes. So we needed a solid segmentation based on behavior, on usage, that we could map to the customer base, and still have also something and segment info on the attitudes of consumers in order to be able to steer our marketeers.
And that is a challenge. That is a challenge where we had to be a bit creative.
Yes.
We put our creative hat on. And it's a question that we are all over again. You know, they want something customers want something very practical. What do we mean by practical? It's age, it's gender. You know, what kind of telco products do they have, and why do they want something practical? Because that sits in their customer database, as Eva said. So that's easy to map. But of course, we all know it's not because you're between 25 and 35 years old that you have a certain attitude. So you also want the kind of understanding what drives their behavior. And that's where we go to motivations, where we go to attitudes. But putting that in one model, that's basically where it breaks down. So typically what we've done in the past is we basically built one model, so one set of segments that needs to answer all these questions. But that, of course, doesn't work. That's where you get your halfway house, you know. So what we now do more and more is build several segment solutions so that we can satisfy several stakeholders. And that's also what we did at Telenet.
Yeah.
You just now see on the screen that we had we call it a top layer, we called it the segments, and they were driven by a life stage. So age, gender, number of kids we had as well. Also behavior, so what kind of telco products do they have? And that gave us kind of 4 or 5 very solid segments that worked really well for mapping to the customer database, but lacking somewhat on that richness of attitudes. So that's where the second model came in, the ones that you see there on the rows. We call them the attitudinal profiles, which really differentiated on what really matters for people most in terms of their telco behavior. But what's kind of the crack of it all is when you develop those 2 segments that you make sure that the lifestyle segments have a little bit of link to the attitudes, and the attitudes have some link to the life stage. And the reason for that, if you then look at the crossing, that that they don't cross on everything, but that you see that certain attitudes map more with the life stage, and vice versa. What was the reaction to that at Telenet, that we worked with a nested model and not just one model?
Yeah, what I like particularly about the nested model is indeed that you can a bit choose how simple or how complex or granular you want the segmentation to be. So you can start or only look at the behavioral segments, or if needed for your use case, you can go a level deeper and also look at the attitudinal segments or sub-segments, let's say.
Good, but what we haven't done is we haven't talked about rules involvement, because you are also part of the success, I would say. I think it's our number 4, optimize research power.
Yeah, indeed. we talked already about attitudes, about life stages, but what we often remark as from a point of view as media agency, we lack information about media insights. We lack information about touch points. And yeah, as a media agency, we are then forced to translate those audience insights into media planning. And we're forced to work with sociodemographics and not real media insights. And there's really the fact where we have an added value as Choreograph. We have our own proper media panel, which on a yearly basis is around 5,000 to 6,000 people, on which have a lot of information, going from sociodemographics to attitudinal statements to hobbies, interests, and of course, a lot of media insights. We are a media agency. And there is that we propose to make the bridge to Telenet segmentation. And one of the first things that we do is when we replicate that segmentation via a recontact is say, okay, but is the distribution, for example, in line with the original segmentation? Are there differences? Because yeah, there can be differences. It can be panel provider, it can be target audience, it can be customer, non-customer segmentation. And there it's important to have the discussion. If we see differences, how are we going to work with it as it is? Or are we, for example, going to change a bit of the algorithm to put people into places? And yeah, it's really nice conversation. And we had this conversation with Telenet, which was really quite interesting. Afterwards, we go into media insights. First, we start with a layer of strategical media insights. To what extent are people consuming media like television, radio, print media, social networks? And are there, for example, big differences between those segments? First insights, but also crucial insights, because if you have a budget as an advertiser, where do you have to put it? How do you have to distribute that budget? That is for paid media, but we also do that for paid, owned, and earned touch points. I think it's valuable information that you know as Telenet, for example, which segments are more open towards email marketing, for example, or the ones that need more expert advice. Valuable insights that are at the base of your segmentation also, and makes it really practical and in order to really use it on a day-to-day basis. Thirdly, we really go in depth. If you would, for example, say, let's do a television campaign for a certain audience, okay, but what are they consuming? Which channels are more popular versus the different segments? So here, what we see is really, okay, let's go in the day-to-day media buying, and let's say, okay, where would we distribute that budget? And the cherry on the cake is, of course, we really aim to make this segmentation practical. We do that via ID cards, via dashboards, in order to implement it really in a day-to-day. And a really cherry on the cake, and I'm talking about the second cherry on the cake.
We only had one cake.
Is the fact that we are able to target that audience in a digital environment. And what you see here on screen is 2 campaigns of Telenet online bannering. And what you immediately see is when you talk about control versus the segment targeting, is the cost per click that went down a lot. And the second of all is the click-through rate that went through the roof. And that was the
number.
That was the number. Voila.
Yeah, it's nice. I mean, it's such a nice case study. I mean, it's a lot of clients would kind of die to have numbers like this, you know. So I would say a real success. Of course, part of that success is also to make sure, I think you mentioned it earlier on, Errol, to make sure that it lives on throughout the organization, throughout time. How are you doing that, Eva, at Telenet?
That's a good question, because it remains a challenge, to be honest, to keep it alive. First, it starts, of course, with ending up with something that's digestible for the audience. So we first gave, for instance, a general presentation towards all stakeholders. And then we did some deep dive sessions with specific teams and really showing them how the segmentation can be used for their specific use case. But then, of course, you have new colleagues joining, and then it remains important, although we try to make it as simple yet granular as possible, it stays something that needs a bit of explanation. And so it's important when new colleagues onboard to also take them through the segmentation to really keep that alive throughout the organization, let's say.
So it's keep onboarding people, and kind of training along the way. And that brings us to our last, I would say, success criteria, which we called aftercare. And dare to adapt. We already covered dare to adapt, changing the names if we think it works better for stakeholders. But invest in aftercare is very important. It's not because it worked once. We got the 50% uplift that it kind of runs, goes on for itself. So that aftercare is important. What we also advise to clients is every so often run a new survey to kind of identify potential changes. Is the segmentation still valid? Has the sizing been
deferred?
Has it been adapted? And that's currently what we're doing now for Telenet as well. We're running a small survey to see if everything is still as we found out in 22 or if things have changed since then. So we're looking forward to see, what change we will encounter. As a wrap up, starting with Eva, if there would be one piece of advice that you would want to give an organization that's kind of considering potentially to do a customer segmentation, what would your piece of advice be?
Okay. From my experience, I'd say make it a joint effort with all the stakeholders that will later on use the segmentation. And really keep that end goal in mind, because there will be trade-offs that will need to be made. And then it's important, or it makes it easier when you keep that end goal in mind. And in the end, that should, in my opinion at least, be an actionable segmentation that continues living throughout the organization and can result in the proof points of success, let's say.
And Roel, what's your piece of advice?
I would say to think it really through. From the start, because if you want to make sure that follow-up is assured, you have to take all those elements into account. What are the goals, for example, of your segmentation? Is it to enrich your CRM? It's a perfect goal, but then that's the goal. If you want to afterwards adapt your campaign briefings on it, think about those next steps also, because otherwise you won't be able to close the loop.
And I'll add a third one. That it's a journey. Customer segmentation. Rome was not built in one day either. It's a safer segmentation. So with those 3 tips in mind, I would like to go back to the concert hall.
Do we want to go back?
Well, if it's going to be another cacophony, I won't tell yet. But I would say sit back again, the 2 of you as well as the audience, and I would say enjoy the orchestra.
Hello, everyone. My name is Timothy Rabiers. I'll be the boobook moderator for the live Q&A session. First of all, thanks to Nicole, Eva, and Roel for that great discussion and some very great and some less great music. Thank you very much. We have a question already in the chat, I see, so that's great. And we have one through a private chat as well. So I would say let's just dive straight in. And the first question that came up that we received was, in the presentation, there's a slide about the use cases for which the segmentation has been used. Can you elaborate somewhat more on this, and how relevant are these for other sectors, especially for B2B, given that this is a B2C case? Perhaps Nicole, you can start.
Yeah, good question indeed. Very much B2C tailored, but the principle of running segmentation and what's important is very relevant if it's now B2C or B2B, or also for another sector. This is now specifically for telco. But I think the steps that we've covered can be applied to all. And of course, the use cases will be different. So for instance, for Telenet, the mapping to the database was very important, but that's not necessarily important for every other, I would say, organization. So the use cases really differ, I would say, client by client.
Okay. Eva or Roel, do you want to add something to that? Or?
No, not really. The use cases are super important for people to have a real feeling on what they can do with it. So yeah, crucial aspects to convince clients also to make use of the segmentation.
Yeah. Okay, we'll move to the second question, which is by Miriam in the Q&A opens panel. So, how did Telenet segments? How were they found back in the media panel, and was the media agency part of the task force at the start? So, two questions in a sense. Think, cool.
Yeah, I think that's me. I think for the one about being part of the task force, I'm gonna let Eva talk about that one. But what we do we have a representative media panel. That means that via the boobook segmentation, you have a sort of golden questions to replicate the segmentation, and that's what we used. We use those golden questions to run through via questionnaire to the media panel, and that way via the algorithm you can applicate those elements and distribute those respondents throughout the segments.
Yeah, indeed, and that was our goal from the start, that we wanted to be able to replicate and to use the segments later on through various channels, also future research, of course. So we needed to have indeed golden questions that could easily find the segment by asking. I think we could choose between 7 or 9 questions, and then we knew which segment somebody was in.
Yeah. Another question popped up by Ben. Thank you very much for that. Relating to the tagging segments on the customer database, knowing that variables were not available in the CRM, what was the process for that, and what percentage of the database was tagged? Very interesting question, I think. And were there any additional data strategy present to tag more customers?
Yeah, so we did actually 2 stages to get to the mapping, let's say. First, we did, let's say, a pre-segmentation research, during which we asked questions, more behavioral and usage questions, and then compared with the data we had available in our database, and then see which questions did map or correspond well with the data that we had, let's say, on usage. And then we kept going with those. And then as they were as the behavior was part of the segmentation algorithm, let's say, we used that to go back to our customer base and tag everybody, let's say. And the way that was done was through for every customer, we have, let's say, a percentage of the degree in which we're certain that think that they belong to a certain segment. Let's say customer A, we think at 70% for this segment, perhaps 10% for the other segment, and 0% for the other segment. And then depending on your, let's say, degree of variation that you accept, you could, for instance, if you have a consumer or a customer that is 50% certain to be in that segment, but 40% in another segment, you could say, okay, let's target both segments or let's target this consumer because he or she is in both segments potentially. So we have a probability, let's say, for each segment per customer. That's how we do it. And then depending on the use case, we choose to target customers with a high probability to be in that segment, or perhaps a bit of wider probability in that segment.
And was everyone tagged? Because I think that's also a question that Ben has. Everyone was tagged. Yeah. So maybe to build a little bit on that, as Eva said, so there were 2 stages. So we basically started what's in the database. so that we could really have the mapping kind of optimize what was currently in the database, hence the 2 stages. But I think Ben is probably also referring that some people might not have anything in the database. And then, of course, additional adding of data will be needed. But we start with pretty, I would say, limited information on the database as well.
We included, I think, over 300 internal variables, and then to see which one map best with research. So that's indeed not feasible for everybody, but it doesn't need to be that much. There are, I think, for every business, there are, let's say, 10 variables that really drive things.
Yeah. Perhaps picking up on that question by David, how to apply the attitudinal profile specifically to new Telenet customers. Is there anything you can add to what's already previously been mentioned?
Yeah, so for the mapping was only possible for the behavioral segments because that's really about the attitudes. Of course, some behavioral segments link more or less with certain attitudes, and then we can make like the assumption that the segment will mostly be this or this attitude. But so because we indeed don't have attitudes in our database, that's not possible for the segment, for the attitudinal subsegments. But we do have an indication because they map quite well, often on behavioral segments.
Yeah.
And that's also a bit why it's you have the CRM system on the one hand, but you have representative market research on the other hand. And what you will of course always have is a question about customer database of Telenet, and there you will make that match between okay, what about new customers? How are they in line? What are prospects? Are they different? Not only socio-demographics, but like attitudinal profiles, like you mentioned, David. So that's a very interesting part of the research, starting from your CRM, but building on towards representative surveys and samples, of course.
And of course, also the attitudinal information and subsegments are also used with Choreograph or with the media agency Wavemaker for targeting through, let's say, online, social, etc. So that can very well be used for those use cases.
I'm going to go to a question from Koen. Thank you very much. Which is, I find interesting. The hardest part is to apply to the whole customer base, the segmentation that has been made based on the market research panel, for the reason that you don't have all the qualitative info from customers. How do you manage that situation? How do you bypass that?
To what extent? I'm not quite understanding to what extent the question differs from the previous one. So I think it's indeed when it comes to attitudes, it's difficult to map if you have a customer base with behavioral and usage data, but we kind of derive it from the main segment, the behavioral segment, let's say. And then the attitudinal info is most used in media buying, media targeting, let's say, but also when designing products and services. For instance, that of course is also taken into account. But for the mapping itself, it's more indirect, let's say, because we indeed don't have that information.
Okay. So the 2 segments are really used for different use cases.
Yes.
So the attitudes is not for one-to-one targeting, as you say. So that's why it's
not through our own channels, let's say. But
exactly.
It could be through social media targeting or online targeting. You can really pinpoint.
Correct.
All right. I hope, Koen, that has answered your question sufficiently. I think another one by Saskia. Was Telenet used to working with customer segmentation? I think Saskia is really looking for some convincing arguments that she can use within her own company to convince them to do segmentation. So this is a very interesting one, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, so we were used with segmentation. Telenet is quite data-driven. We even say that data is the fuel under the hood of the engine, let's say.
Yeah.
So we already had a segmentation. A way in which you could convince, let's say, your stakeholder is really make it tangible. Really list like what are the use cases for which you could use it. You could use it for a strategy, like which segments are we going to target with which brand, let's say, or for instance, I have one brand and I want to target the market, but perhaps my brand is more or less relevant for certain segments. Also, you perhaps want to take notice of competition. Where is competition already doing well? So perhaps I go to another segment. So that's a use case. Another use case is whether or more targeting in the media. Another use case could be business casing. What is the potential of X, Y, Z? When you make products, like how do they products or services, how do they need to look like? What do they need to look like? Then you could also base that on the needs and the attitudes and the behavior of consumers. So there's a lot of different use cases, and making it as tangible as possible what the business can gain with it, because in the end, that's the reason why we do it, will lead, I hope, and I think to a more welcoming attitude towards the segmentation.
Mm-hmm.
It's like finding if an organization already has the answers to everything, then there's no need for segmentation. But typically it's like, if you want to put a new product on the market, or you want to possibly diversify the portfolio, or you want to change your pricing or whatever, typically you come to a point where you think like, but what would be the answer? What will customers think of that, or what will consumers think of that? So if you don't have the answer, that's where segmentation really comes in. And also what I think we already mentioned many use cases now. I think what the beauty is of segmentation is it's one tool that covers a lot of use cases. It's not answering one question, it's answering many questions. And I think that's the power of segmentation. So you can really use it for many different things, really.
We've got another follow-up question in a sense to what you were saying about the golden questions. Question is, are you adding the golden questions to all your quantitative studies?
A lot, yes. Yes, indeed.
Okay.
I think that the importance of that as well is to keep it, have it living on in the organization on and on. So by adding it to new or fresh research, you get fresh perspectives on the segments. And I think that's very important. So it's not like you develop it once and then that's it. You have to add continuously new information to it.
And the reason why we added is because, of course, that we have certain objectives. And then to see what is the status within those segments, and also when we do research to evaluate something, like what are the reaction of the different segments. Also, we follow up on the size of the segments, the market shares within the segments, etc. So that's also, it keeps getting used, let's say.
Yeah, that's a bit the aftercare as well that you mentioned. And we've got a question relating to that as well. Like, how often do you plan? How do you see that aftercare developing, and in terms of frequency? And what's your take on that? Nicole, do you want to jump into that one first?
Well, that's a very good question, because how relevant is that segmentation for after 3 or 4 years? How long will it stay relevant? Mm-hmm. We typically say when we build something, it should ideally be usable for, let's say, 3, 4, 5 years, I would say. But of course, it depends how the world changes. What happens. It also depends on the sector. Certain sectors are more stable than others. So I would say it depends, but I would definitely every 5 years have an overhaul, but really look at it in much more detail. And then every 2 years, look at the sizing at least, I would say.
Yeah.
Okay. We've got another question that came through the private chat. About AI. Obviously, we live in times where AI is omnipresent, so obviously AI and segmentation is also relevant. From Peter, the question was, do any of you think an AI approach on the segments could generate even more out-of-the-box ideas, perhaps less compromising, that could be more efficient, more have greater efficacy? What do you think? What's your take on that?
Shall I start?
Yeah, Nicole. Cool. Yeah.
The way we use AI is, I'll start again. When we approach segmentation, it's kind of twofold. I think building the models, there we are still a firm believer that real data, if I can call it that way, kind of not Gen AI generated, not that we believe on it, but that we base the model on representative sample, market research, as well as customer data, that we can really rely on the robustness. So the development of the segments, I would say we kind of put AI a little bit on the side. I mean, we might use AI to understand what topics we're going to talk to the customers about, but the development of it is really, I would say, on a more traditional way. But that does mean that AI does not play a role. Once we have developed the segments, we put them in a chatbot. So we basically brief a chatbot in a way of who the segments are. And then we use AI to ask further about, can you explain a little bit more who you are, what's important for you? If you can think of one thing in terms of telco that's most important for you, you can ask these questions. So you have a kind of a natural conversation with the segment. So that's kind of an additional benefit. It really brings the segments to life within an organization. Instead of looking at tables and charts, you can just chat with a person, with Maria or whoever. But that's the core of it is still kind of, I would say, solid market research data.
Cool.
Adding to that, AI, you need to use AI for what it's really good at. And that's on the one hand, inspiration, like Nicole is talking about. On the other hand, it's operational excellence. But in this case and in segmentation, you have the human factor, and that's doing the research, making sure that usage within a company is guaranteed. And that's what we call about the aftercare. And that's really the human factor that comes in. But AI, definitely good for multiple purposes, but you have the human factor, which is also very important.
Yeah, I would also add, next to the human factor, it correlates with it, but like the context of your company, your stakeholders know the ins and outs and know what could be relevant to include or not include. And of course, that's something that's still, very important and difficult to capture through AI tools. Of course, afterwards, when you have the segment, like Nicole said, having this chatbot or asking a Gen AI to, okay, this is the description of a person, make a visual or make an infographic about it, those kind of things, yes, for sure.
Yeah, I think a secondary question that Peter put out there, and I'll sort of reframe it a little bit to incite perhaps a bit of a reaction from the three of you. Data crunching is the easiest part and tells the most about your customers. How would you respond to that?
Sorry, say that again.
Data crunching is the easiest part of the process, and it tells the most about your customers.
It tells what your customers do, but not why they do it and what their drivers are.
Yeah.
Can you perhaps elaborate a little bit more on that?
So indeed, we have a lot of information on our customers. We see what they do, what they buy, what they don't do, etc. But it doesn't say why that is the case. It doesn't say anything about their motivations, what they are looking for. And when you, for instance, build a brand strategy or want to know which targets to target or want to see, okay, what products or services are relevant for a certain segment, etc., then in my opinion, you still need that kind of information that you don't necessarily derive from your database. Also, when you want to target non-customers, what do you do then? Because
very relevant. Yeah. Okay, thanks, Peter. We have one more that came through the private chat. Do we actually still need the segmentation, considering it's perfectly feasible to do one-on-one targeting at the moment? Who wants to go with that?
I'll take
Cool. Yeah,
I'll take that one. In theory, you're right. In the current climate, you can indeed target one-on-one, and that's what we call database approach. But you need to have a framework. And from a point of view as a media agency and as an advertiser, you want to strive for a data-based strategy and not only a data-based strategy. And there's where the segmentations come in. Segmentation divides people into groups based on what drives people, what Eva was already talking about. And you can work with these groups and build a campaign strategy around it, for example. Focusing on the elements that tick the box. I think if you just go on one-on-one, you really need a framework. You need some groups where you can say and build your strategy really upon that.
At Telenet, we do a lot of one-on-one communication, to be honest. So it is called, there's a whole team dedicated, 2 teams even, it's called segment of one. So indeed, that is done, that is important, that is relevant. But the segmentation is not only done, at least not for us, with that in mind or with that end goal. So there are other use cases like, okay, what does the market look like? Who do we want to target? Where are we well or not well represented? If we want to go for that segment, what do we need to do? So the whole strategy can also be based on better understanding of the consumer market. So that's another use case. And then also the one-on-one targeting. Again, if you would also think of targeting non-customers, that becomes a bit more difficult.
Yeah.
But as you say, you can't build this.
Yes, that you want. There are different use cases, and depending from one company to another, it will be relevant to have it for one use case, for another, for multiple.
Nicole?
But you can't really build a strategy. Let's say you have 2 million customers. You can't build a strategy for each of your 2 million customers. It's like a little bit what you say, Roel. You need to have that kind of framework, that strategy. If you want to develop new products, for instance, you can't say, well, I have 2 million customers, I'm going to build in a way 2 million products, So you need to have a bit of a simplification almost, what are the key products that we want to put in the market? And that's where segmentation comes along.
Yeah. We've had another question roll in. Again, an interesting one, I find personally. In a world increasingly dominated by digital marketing, where testing is basically infinitely, can optimize again and again. To what extent is the why question, the motivation, still relevant now? And perhaps I'm going to add to it going forward into the future. How is that potentially going to change or not? Nicole, is that something?
Well, I would find it very difficult if I would not know the why, but maybe that's because I'm biased. I'm coming from insights, If I would have to put a product, or if I think about boobook, we put a new service in the market, it's always based on why is someone using this, So you can talk about it. When I talk to a client ourselves, we kind of focus on the why ourselves. I would find it personally very difficult not knowing the why.
Completely.
Because you adapt your language to that.
Yeah, I think it's also about understanding the why, learning the why, and the why of different segments, the customer needs of different segments. And indeed, for digital communication, you could say, we just do A/B testing and then we kind of know. But it doesn't say, it doesn't give you the same insights, let's say. In my opinion.
I think I can actually join in the conversation in that sense, because I think the metaphor of if you just do the testing and digital marketing, that's like looking at the world without glasses, and the why, the motivation is putting on the spectacles, the glasses, and you just see much more clearly, know much better where you're going. So I think I agree with
perhaps to clarify, like you could do the A/B testing or try different things, but you need to know what to try and what to test and what is relevant for the consumers to show. And a segmentation gives insight in, what is relevant for them. And then you can have different variation, you can do testing with different variations, etc. But it's a bit, we're kind of humble enough to think that we don't know all the needs and all the segments, and that's a big point of doing a segmentation. You have mainstream, but you have a lot of other tastes and needs, and kind of also try to accommodate for those.
It's risky not to take it into consideration. So yeah. Okay, perfect. I see that during the last answer session, we've not had any further questions come in. We've had a good couple come in, so thanks for the audience for that. So I want to basically thank first and foremost our speakers of today, Nicole, Roel, and Eva. I think it's been very insightful and very great also to have some music and have the metaphor of the symphony. It's been eye-opening in that sense. So hopefully the audience enjoyed it as well. And it's great to see that there was quite a bit of interaction with some questions as well. So thank you. And of course, thank you to the audience as well for joining. It's absolutely been a pleasure to be able to host this. And hopefully we've been able to add quite a few insights to your pocket so that you can use that for your own within your own company. So based on that note, thank you all. And I would say see you next time.
Bye.
Bye.